Thank you very much, Dr. Filipov. Thanks to you and also to Dr. Bambakaki for inviting me to this very interesting workshop. I hope my transparencies are seen, and can they be changed also? Is everything correct?
Yes, please
go
ahead.
So we will be talking about some efforts to predict properties of polymers, dense polymers. There will not be much solvent here, so I hope you will still find it interesting. So after pointing out the need for multiscale modeling of polymers, we will discuss three examples. The first one comes from polymer melts, where we will be discussing how to predict packing of chains, entanglements, and rheological properties, since these are very important in processing polymers. Then we will go into the glassy state, where we will address how to predict elastic constants and also structural relaxation in the glassy state. And finally, we will see some examples from semi-crystalline polymers, especially the morphologies obtained through the machine direction orientation process that is used to make films for packaging. It is, of course, very desirable to develop modeling and simulation methods to predict properties from chemical constitution. In trying to do so for polymers, we are challenged because there is a tremendous multiplicity of length scales and time scales governing the structure and the motion in polymeric materials. So if we take an amorphous polymer melt, we certainly have structure at the level of individual atoms and bonds, that is angstrom. We have structure at the level of the statistical or Kuhn segment length, such that the entire chain is envisioned as a random walk consisting of such segments. And for usual flexible polymers, this can be on the order of nanometers. We have structure at the level of the entire chain, typically characterized through the chain radius of gyration, and that for moderate molecular weights can be 10 nanometers or more. And we may even have phase or microphase separation phenomena with domains whose size is micrometers. Even broader is the spectrum of characteristic times that we encounter in polymers. Bond vibrations have periods on the order of tens of femtoseconds. Conformational transitions in a bulk polyethylene melt, for example, have waiting times on the order of tens of picoseconds. If we consider longer and longer sequences of segments along a chain, they take longer and longer times to rearrange until we reach the longest relaxation time, the time required for a chain to diffuse by a length commensurate with its size and forget its previous conformation, and that can well be milliseconds or more, depending on molecular weight. If we have phase and microphase separation phenomena, characteristic times may well exceed seconds. And if we go to the configurationally arrested glassy state, the very slow processes of physical aging, whereby the properties of polymers change with time, can have characteristic times of years, some decades of degrees below TG. So this tremendous multiplicity of length scales and time scales constitutes a challenge. By comparison, if we try to do atomistic molecular dynamic simulations, that is, track the temporal evolution of a model of the polymer by solving the equations of motion for all constituent particles on usual laboratory multiprocessor machines, we can go up to microseconds. On specially designed hardware, we can go to milliseconds, but certainly we cannot address the times of years that are relevant, for example, to glasses. What do? We try to develop hierarchical modeling and simulation approaches, which consist of many interconnected levels, each level addressing phenomena over a specific window of time and length scales, from the electronic to the atomistic to the mesoscopic to the continuum, such that we can ultimately bridge what happens at the molecular level with macroscopic properties. And what we will discuss here primarily focuses on the atomistic and mesoscopic level of modeling, the boundary between the two being set rather arbitrarily at 10 nanometers and 100 nanoseconds. So our first concern is to really equilibrate polymer melts and calculate their volumetric structural properties. But indeed, here we are faced with a serious challenge that the time scales of polymer melts, the longest relaxation times, may be many orders of magnitude higher than we can address with molecular dynamics. Fortunately, methodologies based on Monte Carlo are very helpful in resolving this problem. So for a number of years, we have developed what we call connectivity altering Monte Carlo methods, which provide a very vigorous sampling of configuration space. Here I have a cartoon that shows one of these moves that we use in the Monte Carlo, double bridging Monte Carlo. Envision that you have two chains, the blue one and the red one, running near each other in a melt. We can have a move that excises a trimer segment from the blue chain and a trimer segment from the red chain, and subsequently builds two new trimer bridges between the pieces of chain that have remained, so as to give you two new conformations with exactly the same molecular weight as originally, but very different from the original ones. This move, in conjunction with more local moves in the context of a well-designed Monte Carlo algorithm, can provide much more vigorous sampling of very different configurations of the multi-chain polymer systems and induce equilibration many orders of magnitude faster than molecular dynamics. Let me show you some examples of predictions that are obtained through such connectivity altering Monte Carlo simulations. Here we have a linear polyethylene melt. The molecular weight can vary. Let's see, this is a box that is filled with polymer segments with periodic boundary conditions representative of the melt. And here at the top left, you see one of the chains participating in the melt. It is 6,000 carbon atoms long. If we use a force field that has been proposed for low molecular weight alkanes and equilibrate with connectivity altering Monte Carlo, we're in a position to calculate thermodynamic properties like the density under a given pressure and temperature as a function of the chain length. So here we have the specific volume, the inverse density, as a function of the chain length in a homologous series of monodisperse linear polyethylenes. And we see a hyperbolic dependence. If we have very short chain length, then the density is low. But then if we increase the chain length, we see that the density asymptotes out to a long molecular weight limit. And what we predict with this very simple force fields proposed for alkanes is very much in line with experimental measurements. We can also characterize the structure in these melts. How do chains pack? And if we predict the X-ray diffraction pattern, this is the static structure factor as a function of the wave vector, we see an amorphous halo, a first peak that reflects intermolecular correlations. Carbons, neighboring carbons sitting on different chains have a tendency to have a distance roughly 0.55 nanometers from each other. So that leads to this first peak. But then we have the other peaks, which are mainly intramolecular due to the bonding along the chains. And both inter and intramolecular characteristics of structure are captured very well in comparison to experiment. Now, the fact that we can equilibrate polymer melts gives us access also to entanglements. So we and other groups have developed algorithms to locate entanglements among chains, since these are very important to the rheological properties. And here we have essentially a depiction of an algorithm that we have designed, which we call CRETA, contour reduction topological analysis. We take the fully equilibrated atomistic system, we fix the chain ends, which are shown here in white, and then we proceed to reduce the contours of all the chains present, subject to the condition that two chains cannot cross each other. During the latter stages of this reduction, we also decrease the diameters of these chains. So ultimately, the atomistic configuration is reduced to a network of zigzag lines, which come together at topological constraints with a coordination number of 4. These zigzag lines are a representation of the primitive paths of the chains according to Sam Edwards, and the topological constraints are entanglements. and we can go in and analyze a very large sequence of such configurations sampled by Monte Carlo and get statistical properties of the entanglement network. Here are some results obtained from this kind of network analysis. We have three polymers, polyethylene of, or four rather, polyethylene of two different molecular weights, polybutadiene, polyethylene terephthalate, and atactic polystyrene that have been thoroughly equilibrated and then subjected to this topological analysis. Very easily from the topological analysis, you can compute the mean length of a primitive path, this mean LPP that is shown here. So we can calculate the Kuhn length of the primitive path, which is representative of the entanglement tube diameter. And you can also translate that into a molecular weight, calculate the molecular weight between entanglements. These properties here are shown in the third and fourth column of this table. And we see that as predicted by the topological analysis, they turn out to be in very good agreement to the best estimates available from Plateau modulus, for example, measurements by Lou Fettes. The last column in this table displays what is called the packing length. That is a characteristic of, it is essentially a measure of how fat the chains are in relation to how stiff they are. It can be computed directly from the molecular weight, the density of the melt at the mean squared radius of gyration. And we see that that too is in very good comparison as predicted by the simulation to experiment. And that's not surprising because we can actually compute very well the dimensions of the chains and the density, which means that the simulation results closely follow a correlation that has been proposed by Fettes and others a long time ago, which gives you the entanglement molecular weight as a function of the density and the packing length. So that is followed by the simulation points as well. So we can fully equilibrate polymer melts. We can also quantify entanglements in these melts. How can we estimate rheological properties like viscosity? We cannot do molecular dynamics since the longest relaxation times are so much longer than what we can do with molecular dynamics. So this leads us to resort to a mesoscopic dynamical approach. We coarse grain the polymer model. So each atomistic chain we map into a sequence of beads and springs. Each bead in what we will discuss here will stand for something like 50 carbon atoms, and the beads are connected together with nonlinear springs that describe the entropic elasticity of the subchains connecting them. If there are cross-links in the system, these too are represented as beads. And it is important also to represent entanglements at this mesoscopic approach. So following ideas in the recent literature, we introduce what is called slip links, or slip springs rather. The slip springs are essentially nonlinear springs which connect segments or beads on neighboring chains or on different chains. And each end of a slip spring is envisioned as being capable of executing infrequent jumps between adjacent beads on the chain to which it belongs. If in the course of this jumping process, this slip spring comes to a chain end, it may choose to slip off of the chain end and be annihilated. But all the time, new slip springs are created as chain ends seek to entangle with other beads of other chains in their neighborhood. So we design a coarse-grained dynamical simulation method, which from the technical point of view is a Brownian dynamics kinetic Monte Carlo simulation. Brownian dynamics in order to track the diffusive motion of the beads in three-dimensional space. Kinetic Monte Carlo in order to follow the slippage of the slip springs and the creation of new slip springs by chain ends. The nice thing about this is that all the parameters required in the mesoscopic approach can be obtained from the atomistic approach. We use, for example, mesoscopic intra-chain effective potentials for these nonlinear springs, which are obtained by Boltzmann inversion of the respective distribution functions, probability distribution functions of the end-to-ends of the subchains. We use a local density-dependent non-bonded free energy density from which we actually, through an equation of state, we can model non-bonded interactions in this coarse-grained system. And we also use bead friction factors for the Brownian motion and hopping rate constants for the slip springs, which are obtained from atomistic molecular dynamics simulations. So all the mesoscopic model relies on the force field, the atomistic force field eventually, but it is something like 1,000 times faster than atomistic molecular dynamics because of the simplicity that is provided by the coarse-grained representation, the much lower number of degrees of freedom. So here we see some predictions for rheological properties. On the left, we have the zero shear viscosity as a function of molar mass, again, across the homologous series of linear polyethylenes at 450 Kelvin at 1 bar. We see some data from molecular dynamic simulations. These are inevitably concentrated in the low molar mass region because only there can we address the relevant timescales. But then we also see the red and the green points which come from this Brownian dynamics kinetic Monte Carlo simulation approach applied under non-equilibrium and equilibrium conditions. And we see that they nicely represent what is happening in reality in entanglements. They are being compared with data from Dimitris Vlasopoulos on these melts. And they actually agree with the idea that the zero shear viscosity goes like molecular weight to the 3.4 power as predicted by reptation theory if one incorporates contour length fluctuations and constraint release. So we have a good handle on predicting the zero shear viscosity in these very long chain melts that cannot be addressed with molecular dynamics. On the right-hand side, we have now viscosity, not zero shear viscosity, as a function of the shear rate to which these melts are subjected under steady shear conditions. The shear rate, gamma dot, is multiplied by the longest relaxation time of each melt. Here we have 4 different molecular weights to form the Weissenberg number, which essentially tells us how fast the flow is in relation to the intrinsic relaxation times of the chains. We see that at low Weissenberg numbers, the viscosity adopts an asymptotic constant value. We have a Newtonian plateau. But for large Weissenberg numbers, we see a clear reduction in the viscosity with increasing shear rate. That is, we have a shear thinning behavior, a very well-known characteristic or nonlinear rheological property of polymer melts that automatically emerges from this mesoscopic modeling. The exponent with which the viscosity goes as a function of the Weissenberg number is in reasonable agreement to what is measured experimentally. The simulation also gives us the molecular region for this shear thinning behavior. Here we have distributions of the end-to-end distances of chains in melts of 2 different molecular weights. Both are entangled here. And we see these distributions for a variety of Weissenberg numbers from very low ones, the black one, to very large ones, the red one. And we see that whereas for low Weissenberg number, the chains adopt a Gaussian or unperturbed conformation in the flowing melt. If we have a very fast flow, the chains are clearly unraveled. We have a much broader end-to-end distribution. We can also look at the orientation of end-to-end vectors of the chains with respect to the 3 coordinate axes of the shearing system. And clearly here we see, using this P2 Legendre polynomial, that the chains for low Weissenberg numbers are randomly oriented. However, as we increase the Weissenberg numbers, there is a strong tendency for the chains to orient along the x-axis, the velocity axis, and perpendicular to the y and z axes. As a consequence of that, there is development of the so-called first and second normal stress differences. You may observe that there is a small difference in the P2 between the y and z axes, and these are very reasonably reproduced by the mesoscopic simulation. So much for polymer melts. Well, there is another example actually for polymer melts. Here we are trying to calculate G prime and G double prime. We saw them also in the previous talk. So we are subjecting this melt to an oscillatory deformation causing a periodic shear on the melt. And we measure the stresses that are in phase and out of phase with this imposed deformation. These give us G prime and G double prime respectively. We predicted here for polybutadiene melt as a function of the frequency, the angular frequency. And the G prime is shown with the filled symbols, the G double prime with the open symbols. The predictions from the mesoscopic simulation are the red points. The measurements from a melt of very comparable molecular weight are the black points. We see overall quite good agreement, especially at low frequencies, which are completely inaccessible by molecular dynamics. We see that due to the entanglement, there is a plateau region here at intermediate frequencies because the chains cannot be relieved of their entanglement. So the response is very similar to that of a cross-linked elastomer with a plateau modulus 0.42 megapascal. But then if we go to very low omegas, very low frequencies, we see that the response is primarily viscous. There is a tremendous drop in G prime, and there is actually even a maximum in G double prime, maximum dissipation at a frequency commensurate with the inverse relaxation time of the melts. This is well reproduced by the mesoscopic model. So we have used this model for a variety of applications involving, for example, the design of adhesives and adhesive failure in the design of such adhesives. So let's now leave the melts and try to go to glasses. Simulating a glass is a notoriously difficult problem because a glass is a non-equilibrium material. Its properties, for example, depend to a large extent on the history of its formation, such as the cooling rate. And also the properties of a glass gradually change with time through the process of physical aging. So in order to simulate a glass since a long time, we have found it very useful to assert that a glassy configuration is trapped in the vicinity of a local minimum of the potential energy hypersurface, where it executes fast oscillatory motion. Some minima may be connected across rather low barriers, so they may form a meta basin out of the basins around the individual minima, but largely there are very high barriers which inhibit motion in configuration space. These minima have been called inherent structures by Frank Stillinger, and the regions around the minima are called basins. So really a glass is a collection of these basins, the exact distribution among the basins being dictated by the history of formation of the glass. This is sort of a two-dimensional depiction of this very rugged potential energy hypersurface characteristic of a glass. Essentially, the glass properties are envisioned as being arithmetic or quenched averages over these individual basins of attraction. Within each basin of attraction, there is a restricted equilibrium established. There is not, however, equilibrium across the whole configuration space because of these barriers that cannot be overcome at ordinary temperatures. So in order to form glassy specimens, we start from a very well-equilibrated melt, and we quench into these minima of potential energy. While we reside in such a minimum, we perform a quasi-harmonic approximation. That is, we expand the potential energy as a function of the mass-weighted coordinates of all atoms out to second order. And we diagonalize the Hessian matrix of second derivatives so as to calculate the eigenfrequencies of vibrational motion around each of these minima. From these eigenfrequencies, we can calculate vibrational partition functions, so we can write Helmholtz energy for the system as long as it is confined in the vicinity of a minimum, in a basin that is, and that consists of the energy of the minimum plus a vibrational Helmholtz energy associated with these vibrational partition functions. Now, both the energy at the minimum and the frequencies of oscillation are functions of the spatial extent of the system. If we change the dimensions of the model system, these properties change. So essentially, this gives us a fundamental equation of thermodynamics, the Helmholtz energy as a function of temperature, volume, and number of particles that we can use in order to estimate properties of the system as long as it is residing in a basin. That strategy is followed, for example, here. We perform this quasi-harmonic approximation over a variety of basins representative of a very common glass, glaciatactic polystyrene under 1 atmospheric conditions. So we see here some predictions for the specific volume as a function of temperature obtained by this quasi-harmonic approximation in the vicinity of different basins and averaging over the basins. We also see results from molecular dynamics simulations. Here we have used a very nice potential energy model by Alexei Lulin to simulate polystyrene. And we see that we can predict the expansivity, the specific volume as a function of temperature for glassy polystyrene. For higher temperatures, the molecular dynamics gives us a considerably higher expansivity. We have a glass transition, and the glass point here is around 100 degrees centigrade, close to the experimental one because the force field is quite good. We can use the same kind of quasi-harmonic approximation to assess elastic properties, elastic constants for such a glass. So we can subject the model glass to anisotropic stress situations, for example, a situation where we impose a tensile or a compressive stress on the sample, whereas the lateral surfaces are exposed to atmospheric pressure. And from the changes in dimension at the Gibbs energy minimum that we obtain for the glass, we can calculate a stress-strain plot. For relatively small stresses, the response is elastic. So we can use the slope of the stress strain in order to calculate the Young's modulus. And we can use the lateral contraction or expansion in order to calculate Poisson ratios. So here we see estimates for atactic polystyrene of the Young's modulus, of its temperature derivative, of the Poisson ratio and its temperature derivative, being compared to experimental values, which are abundant for polystyrene. And we see that this quasi-harmonic approximation does not do a very bad job in predicting both the values of the elastic constants and their temperature dependence. Now, it is a much more difficult problem to try to address relaxation, this gradual change in structure in the glass and consequent change in properties. And in this landscape picture of glasses, relaxation is really a consequence of infrequent transitions between different basins on the landscape. So what we try to do is we start from a local minimum and we calculate as many as possible saddle points leading out of that minimum in the full multidimensional configuration space of the glassy system. From a saddle point, we tumble down into another minimum, so we can construct a full reaction path or transition path that goes from minimum A to minimum B across the saddle point. And from that, through harmonic transition state theory, you can also calculate rate constants for going from A to B and from B to A. We can do the same for other minima connected to A or for minima connected to B. So we can actually build a network of minima with the rate constants between them being known through harmonic transition state theory. And so we can have a full connected network of these minima on which to track the rearrangement of the system. This is simply a movie of a very elementary transition from minimum to minimum for polystyrene. You see that this involves a cooperative rearrangement of atoms, and this is the energy profile of that transition. The reaction coordinate here is the Euclidean norm of the displacement of all the atoms, and we clearly go over a maximum in this diagram, which in this case is not very high. It is 1.5 kT. So we do this over and over again, and we can then build a network of basins or minima, which are connected together through paths for which we know the rate constants, both forward and reverse. And here, essentially, you see two categories of basins. The ones shown in blue are what we call explored basins. They are basins for which we have exhaustively calculated as many as possible saddle points leading out of them. The black ones are what we call boundary basins. They are basins that are connected to explored basins, but not yet explored themselves. So we actually have a scheme whereby, as time goes by, we put more and more basins or more and more points in this network. Each time we select a boundary basin and we append it to the set of explored basins by really exploring it, getting other basins connected to it. And so we can progressively track the very complex connectivity in this landscape as time goes on. Now, on this network, we can actually solve analytically a set of master equations that govern the probabilities of occupancy of the basins. We start the system in a given basin, which is the red point you see here. And then we essentially solve this set of equations for all the basins, which simply say that the rate of change of the probability of occupancy of each basin is equal to the influx of probability from other basins connected to it, minus the efflux of probability to other basins. And in this latter sum, we include the boundary basins at which we have absorbing boundary conditions. So one can essentially start a simulation, which is really a solution of the master equation. It's the equivalent of tracking all the possible trajectories out of the initial basin, which tell us how the probability redistributes itself among the basins as time goes by. And that we see here in this color scheme. As the clock is ticking, we see that more and more basins acquire colors like purple and blue, which are high probability, purple and red rather. Red is very high probability, whereas the blue is zero probability. And as time goes on, spread of the system on its landscape to more and more basins. The simulation here terminated at a time which is roughly 1 millisecond. Now, from these trajectories, from these rather solutions of the master equation, we can calculate interesting properties. So here we have a probability efflux to the boundary states as a function of time. And we have results from different sizes of the set of explored states, starting from just one explored state and then going to 10, to 100, 200, 300, 600, and so on. So we see that if we include a sufficient number of explored states in this network, which is progressively enriched on the fly, we approach an asymptotic distribution of this probability efflux to the boundary states, which exhibits very well-defined maxima, indicating that there are some relaxation processes taking place in the glass. One, for example, here at room temperature is at 10 to the minus 10 seconds. The other one at roughly 10 to the minus 6 seconds. So we can take these times and bring them to an Arrhenius plot, log time versus 1 upon temperature, and they are these blue points that you see here. We can repeat this landscape-based calculation at lower temperatures below the glass transition, so we get these other blue points that you see. And amazingly, it seems that these characteristic times that are predicted by the landscape-based simulation are close to times that people have measured as subglass relaxation transition processes, the one called gamma and the other one called delta. These have been measured by dielectric spectroscopy and neutron scattering measurements. So it seems that we are tracking these subglass relaxation transitions through this procedure of exploring progressive transitions in this landscape of the polymer glass. For comparison, on the left-hand side here, above the glass transition, we have relaxation times that have been computed for the main or alpha relaxation transition by tracking the reorientation dynamics of pendant bonds in this atactic polystyrene. They are again in good agreement with experiments from dielectric spectroscopy, for example, and they are clearly non-arrhenius. They are essentially WLF or Fogel-Fulcher-Taman, whereas the subglass relaxation transitions are arrhenius. And that is in full agreement with what we see in experiments. So this landscape-based approach can actually give us subglass relaxation transitions and complete the picture of relaxation in an amorphous polymer that can be obtained in the melt by molecular dynamics. Now let's move to another type of dense polymers. These are semicrystalline polymers. We will be concerned mainly with polyethylene. Polyethylene, polypropylene, these are polymers that are very much used in packaging applications. Nowadays, people are interested in developing monomaterial as opposed to multi-layer packaging because that is much more amenable to recycling. Now, what we try to do in packaging is have a material that has low permeability to molecules like oxygen or water, and thereby protect the packaged product, and also good mechanical properties. And there are very well established processing operations leading to such packaging films. Here we are concerned with what is called machine direction orientation. You can see that the polymer is brought in, preheated in these cylinders, and then it passes through these drawing rolls, which move at a different linear speed. So they subject this film to a tensile deformation. Then it is annealed and then cooled and then brought out at a tremendous speed, something like 300 meters per second. The temperature here at the drawing stage is a bit below the melting temperature, such that a semicrystalline morphology develops, and the draw ratio is 2:1 to 10:1. Clearly, the morphology, which is very important for understanding the permeability properties, is shaped by this processing operation. So we would like to get some understanding of the relationship between the morphology that develops, the chemical constitution, such as architecture of the polymer chains and molecular weight distribution of the polymer, and also the processing conditions such as the temperature and the strain rate that are used in this machine direction orientation. So this blue here just shows you where the drawing takes place. We have designed molecular dynamics simulations in order to simulate, first of all, the drawing process, and secondly, the annealing process. For the drawing process, we start from a very well equilibrated polyethylene melt from connectivity altering Monte Carlo, and we subject it to a deformation in molecular dynamics at prescribed strain rate epsilon dot, which elongates the system in the Z direction, in the machine direction, whereas in the transverse direction, X, the dimensions of the system are kept constant to emulate the formation of a film. In the third direction, in the Y direction, the film is exposed to atmospheric pressure, so it is free to contract. We have what is called the plane strain situation in this computer experiment. Then for annealing, we obtain this elongated melt or system, and we keep it at a stress equal to the stress that prevailed at the end of the stretching, and we simply let it develop its semicrystalline morphology and stabilize. It is important now in these calculations to quantify the degree of crystallinity in these systems. So in order to do so, we use a criterion suggested by Takashi Yamamoto, which is very useful, and it gives us results which are fully consistent with other criteria based on enthalpy or density. What is done by Yamamoto is essentially one partitions the whole system into small boxes of edge length roughly equal to the two times the sigma of the Lennard-Jones of the methylene unit. And within each of these boxes, one considers all the chords, a chord being a straight line segment connecting the midpoints of two adjacent bonds, and accumulates a P2 Legendre polynomial from all these chords inside the box. So that gives us a directional correlation of the chords inside the box. If that P2 is higher than 0.7, then the box can be declared as crystalline according to Yamamoto, and if it's below 0.7, it is still amorphous. And that criterion, as I mentioned, gives us very consistent results to other criteria that may be based on the enthalpy or on the density of the boxes. So here we have a molecular dynamics trajectory of what happens to this originally molten polymer when we pull it at a temperature of 350 Kelvin at a strain rate of 10 to the 6th inverse seconds. The chains are 1,000 carbons long. So we start the pulling, and beyond, we see that some nuclei develop, but then beyond a certain point, there is certainly nucleation and growth of crystalline domains, anisotropically, in fact, and also the formation of these domains by the flow field. At some point, we see also a secondary nucleation. There is a new lamella that is formed among the pre-existing ones until we reach something like a factor of 5 elongation in the system. Here's how the crystallinity develops as a function of the stretch ratio, which goes from 1 to 5. So we see that a very complex semicrystalline morphology is developing, and that would be highly relevant to designing the permeability of the polymer. The more tortuous the amorphous paths are, the amorphous sort of phase is, then the lower the permeability, and that could help us design polymers which are just polyethylene but have a low permeability. The first thing we tried to do quantitatively on these results was to assess the nucleation rate as a function of temperature and strain rate for this linear polyethylene. And in order to analyze the nucleation, we have adopted the so-called mean first passage time analysis. Nucleation is an infrequent event across a free energy barrier. So here we have to define an order parameter. As such, we define the size of the largest nucleus present in the system, and max, that is measured in methylene units. And tau is simply the mean time over many repeated molecular dynamic simulations that is required for the maximum size of a nucleus to reach a specific value. So we get this sigmoidal relation, from the simulations. You see the points here. And there are very nice theories by Wedekind and also extended by Greg Rutledge and his collaborators for understanding or quantifying this dependence of the mean first passage time on the size of the nucleus. They lead under certain approximations to the expression shown here. So by fitting this expression, one can get out the critical size of a nucleus. What is the size of a nucleus that sits at the top of the free energy barrier and can therefore grow? One can get the induction time, tau star, which you see here is the time roughly corresponding to the knee in these plots. One can get the Zeldovich factor, which is essentially the probability that a nucleus that sits at the top of the barrier will grow rather than redissolving back into the melt. And one can also get the growth rate from the long time or large nucleus part of this plot. So we fit this expression to the simulation results, and the nucleation rate, how many nuclei are formed per unit time per unit volume, is simply 1 over tau star V, where V is the volume of the system. So here we have a study of how the properties relevant to nucleation vary with the strain rate. You see epsilon dot in logarithmic coordinates is the abscissa at constant temperature. The temperature here is 350 Kelvin. And clearly we see that the induction time gets smaller as the strain rate increases. The nucleus size is somewhat smaller as epsilon dot increases. The nucleation rate increases dramatically with epsilon dot, and the growth rate also increases. So in general, crystallization is favored by large extension ratios. We can see a corresponding study of these properties as a function of temperature under constant strain rate. Here, the constant strain rate is something like 10 to the 7th inverse seconds. And here, because if we have a higher temperature, the thermodynamic driving force for nucleation of the solid phase is lower. We're closer to the melting point. So understandably, we see that the induction time increases, the nucleation becomes more difficult, N-star, the critical nucleus size increases, the nucleation rate decreases, and very interestingly, the growth rate exhibits a maximum, which has also been seen in experiments. We tried to understand this a little bit better by forming sort of a theory of the simulation. And in this, we were helped by ideas by Ziabitsky. So Ziabitsky tells us that a crystal nucleus in the melt is formed by an assemblage of kinetic elements. What is a kinetic element in polyethylene crystallization? We analyzed the configuration that we obtained through the molecular dynamics, and we concluded that a good choice for a kinetic element would be an all-trans sequence of methylenes, roughly 0.9 nanometers in length, and of a radius comparable to that of a chain, 0.25 nanometers. So we envision that these kinetic elements sort of come together and form nuclei. And if the number of kinetic elements in a nucleus is sufficiently large, we get a critical nucleus that can then grow. G star is the size of a critical nucleus. So we tried to follow the concepts of classical nucleation theory to sort of quantify this model. As you may remember, classical nucleation theory tells us that the Gibbs energy change associated with formation of a nucleus has two contributions. One is a bulk contribution, because what was previously occupied by melt is now occupied by crystal, and that goes like the volume of the aggregate of kinetic elements. And that's why you see this PR squared L0G here. This delta G of V, delta GV is the density, the Gibbs energy density associated with the phase transition. This is a favorable or negative term because we are undercooled, we're below the melting temperature. On the other hand, we have a surface term. There is new surface being created, and that is a free energy penalty, which goes like the surface area of that aggregate. If this were a perfectly cylindrical aggregate, this nu, the exponent, would be 1/2. But since it is not, as observed in molecular dynamics, we sort of chose to leave this nu and c as adjustable parameters. Gamma is the interfacial free energy, the interfacial tension between solid and liquid. Now, this delta GV in this very complex transient processing situation is not simply what one would have for quiescent crystallization. There is certainly a term associated with the phase transition, and that is immediately expressed in terms of the undercooling and the enthalpy of fusion of the polymer. But there is certainly another term which is associated with the orientation of the chains, which facilitates the crystallization. And to estimate this term, since we have very fast flows here, we adopted an elastic approximation. We express this delta G caused by the flow in terms of the tensile stress that is imposed on the system. This is an appropriate expression for this plane strain situation that we use. So we can really calculate this delta G from the simulation, since we monitor the stress. So if you maximize this delta G, which contains all the contributions with respect to the critical to G, then you get the critical nucleus size, and you can translate that into N star, the critical nucleus, in methylene units. And as you see here, the predictions by fitting these two parameters are quite close to what one gets from the simulation. So one has sort of an understanding of what is happening during nucleation in these systems. We have gone further to adopt a Fokker-Planck type equation for the size distribution of the nuclei, and express the nucleation rate with still another adjustable parameter, and we see that that too can rationalize what we see in terms of the nucleation rate as a function of strain rate and temperature. Very recently, we have actually created stable solid films at room temperature out of these simulations, both the flow-induced crystallization and also quiescent crystallizations that we have undertaken. And we have performed an estimation of the solubility of oxygen in these semi-crystalline films. We have calculated the Henry's log constant essentially for oxygen in these films by Widom insertions. So here we see the solubility of oxygen as a function of the degree of crystallinity for the quiescently crystallized films with the red points, and for the films crystallized under flow, these are the blue points. And we see that there is a dependence on crystallinity, which is almost linear. Of course, there is a very small range of crystallinity here, and it is not far from actual measurements that were made a long time ago on high-density polyethylenes by Michaels and collaborators. So we would like to extend that, also calculate diffusivities in these semi-crystalline films, and talk about the permeability as a function of morphology, which is induced by the processing. So to summarize, there is a tremendous challenge associated with long times and length scales in polymers that can be met through careful design of statistical mechanics-based multiscale modeling methods. We have seen that connectivity altering Monte Carlo moves allow us to equilibrate very, very long chain melts and provide access to entanglements, which we can quantify through topological analysis. And based on these sort of computer measurements, we can design hybrid particle field mesoscopic simulations that address time scales that are by 3 orders of magnitude longer than is possible with molecular dynamics, and thereby track entangled dynamics in the melt. And surprisingly, without any adjustment, these reproduce the linear and nonlinear viscoelastic properties of these melts. Glasses are very challenging. We have seen that we can estimate through a quasi-harmonic approximation the volumetric properties and their elastic constants. If we are interested in relaxation, then we can use this idea of solving the master equation for the occupancy probabilities of different basins on the landscape representative of a glass, the network of considered basins being expanded all the time as time goes by, and that reveals subglass relaxation transitions for polystyrene, for example, that seem to be representative of what is measured experimentally. We have also seen the application of molecular dynamics on fast flows for crystal nucleation and growth and development of semi-crystalline morphology. And there we can rationalize the dependence on strain rate and on temperature and obtain complex morphologies whose design is really critical to producing monomaterial packaging, packaging products. In general, one could say that seamless connections between the electronic, atomistic, mesoscopic, and continuum approaches, nowadays aided by machine learning, can lead to practical computer-aided materials design tools that are applicable in an industrial setting. I would like to thank my collaborators who did the work that I presented you, those who supported it financially, and certainly you for your attention.